Okay, welcome to comparative review for Unit 1. I'm just going to kind of follow a kind of template up here, following along with your study guide, the same thing that we've done in class. So we'll just start with, first of all, we have the comparative method. So thinking about why we study comparative. You need to be thinking about those things that we talked about the fact that it helps us to know more about the world around us, that it helps us to the whole global citizen idea, and I would know probably 3 reasons of why it is important. It helps us to be able to understand our own country better. It helps us to better compare and look at other possibilities, other options, ways of doing things. It helps us to learn from other countries' mistakes. All of these are reasons why we study comparative. One of the other things we need to think about is quantitative versus qualitative. So knowing which one's normative, which one's empirical, keeping straight that with quantitative we are talking about numbers and qualitative is more value judgment. So really ideal is somewhere in between there, and just making sure that we understand the differences between those. When we're thinking about grouping of nations, we discussed there's kind of 3 options. One of the things that we looked at was the old way where this was based on communism, where we had the first world, the second world, and then the third world. And the first world being your advanced democracies, capitalist countries like America. The second world being communist or post-communist countries like the Soviet Union, currently Russia. And then the third being all those developing nations. Rather insulting, so then we came up with instead having advanced democracies, and then the communist or post-communist, and then we have the industrializing countries. Those countries are newly developing, is another word we say. Another term we learned was global south versus global north. There's also kind of that old school way, like I mentioned, the LEDCs versus less economically developed versus your advanced or more economically developed nations. LEDCs, not LEDSs. So just ways to think about grouping countries. Okay, we talked about sovereignty, authority, and power. So one of the things we kind of looked at was this chart, thinking about, and hopefully we know kind of what goes in each of these, but we have a state, then we have a regime, and then we have a government. So understanding the difference of a nation versus a state. So, for example, you have the state of the UK, which is made up of 4 nations. Those 4 nations being England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. Nations are people with a common culture, language, and identity and ethnicity. They can be a state, or they, like Germany, the German people is a German state, Germany. But they also could be a state. What we usually say country is made up of several nations. So just understanding that difference. Probably going to see a short answer question asking about nations and what nations make up the UK. We also talked about regime types. So you have your state, then you have your regime. So kind of our 2 regimes we talked about were democracies, and we talked about authoritarian, which I believe I spelled wrong. But democracy, we have 2 types. We can have liberal or we can have illiberal. And a liberal democracy, remember that in both democracies in general, we're going to have elections, free competitive elections. But the difference with liberal versus illiberal is that in a liberal, civil liberties, civil rights are being protected. And in an illiberal, they are not being protected. Or there's just violations, like think about freedom of press, those kind of things. And if we're thinking about our countries that we're talking about, the UK is definitely advanced liberal democracy. Russia would be a great example of an illiberal democracy. Authoritarian states would be where China and a lot of people would argue Iran falls. And so authoritarian, where you kind of have a small group in power, there's just not as much freedom. For example, in Iran, they do actually elect a president, but the Ayatollah is a supreme leader and has total power. And in China, you have no real elections in the fact that there's one party and they choose the leader. It also has to do with how much freedoms you may have. We talked about levels of government, like the difference between federal versus unitary versus confederal, okay? And thinking about our countries, so if we just did a little chart, reminding ourselves, so if we have the UK, Mexico, Russia, China, Nigeria, and Iran, okay? So if we're thinking about our countries, we're looking there. The UK is going to be unitary. Mexico is going to be federal, as is Nigeria. Remember, when all else fails, they're going to be the most like the U.S. Russia is also federal, 3 unitary. China is going to be unitary. They don't want to give up any power. Iran is going to be unitary. In a federal system, power is going to be shared among your regional levels. In our case, in the United States, states or provinces, territories, different words for different countries. And your national government. It's actually shared. Some responsibilities are at your regional level, some responsibilities at a national level. We see this in Russia. We see this in Mexico. We see this in Nigeria. In the unitary, all of that power is in the national government. They give very little power to the localities. We see this in the UK. We see this in China. We see this in Iran. When we think about confederal is all the powers in the regional levels. It's the opposite of unitary, and we really don't see any countries really functioning that way today. The European Union is a good example of confederal. There's a lot of autonomy on the regional levels, but there are some rules they do have to follow. When we think about this with unitary, one of our key words is devolution, that giving of the power more down to the regional levels. And the UK is doing this by giving more power to those in Ireland, getting my eyes mixed up. A good example of this would be in Scotland, how the Scottish Parliament has more authority. Since the referendum, the vote did not go for Scottish independence, the Prime Minister, David Cameron, has promised more and more devolution to the citizens of Scotland. In a federal system, we see the opposite of that, where there's centralizing power, which we see in Russia. In Russia, they're taking those power away from the regional governments, and they're giving those giving them back to the national government, where Putin is trying to just kind of consolidate power. So that's something that we do see with federal and unitary. You think about what's the advantages and disadvantages. Federal systems work better when you have a diverse population, when you have a large country. Unitary works better when you're smaller. Like the United States, federal is perfect for us. We're so big, we're so diverse. We really need a federal system. Russia is so large, it needs that federal system. UK is small. In a unitary system, resources are going to be allocated more evenly, but then on the other hand, kind of the disadvantage of a unitary, which is the advantage of a federal, is the fact that we see you're going to hear more minority voices are going to be heard. On a federal level, you can leave it up to the regionals what they need for their state, their region. They know better. Okay, so check over that PowerPoint that we did. Had some kind of advantages and disadvantages from Lesson 2. Okay, the other things we need to talk about is a supranational, which is above kind of, you've got your local, regional, national, and then you have supranational. That's what we say our levels are. So like in the UK, you have London, which is part of England, which is part of the UK, which is part of the European Union. So a supranational organization. Another example of a supranational organization would be OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Iran would be a member of that. Know an example, maybe 2 examples of supranational organizations. Know a good definition for it. It's one of your vocabulary terms. And know one of our CG6 countries, what they go in. Iran is in OPEC. UK is in the EU. The majority of them are in NATO. Not in NATO, in the United Nations. I apologize. NATO, UK would be in NATO, and that would be the end of that list. I'm not sure about where Mexico, if they're in that, but the UK for that. All right, political socialization, the process by which we develop our political ideologies. I feel like I'm beating a dead horse with that. Political ideologies, our belief, political culture. No, kind of those terms, conservative versus liberal versus radical versus revolutionary. I'll mention real quickly, too, the difference between a revolution versus a coup d'etat. In a revolution, we are overthrowing a regime. In a coup, we are overthrowing the government, our leader. Okay, so think about the Russian Revolution, which we move from the Tsarist regime to communism. Or you think about a coup when they try to oust Gorbachev. All right, let's move on to lesson 3 with the political and economic change. So with the types of change, that's that kind of radical, revolutionary, like how are we making things change, how are they moving? We're thinking about global trends. You need to know all of your global trends. So if we're thinking global trends, we've got democratization, globalization, the rise of ethnic conflicts, and the increase or rise of market economies. Okay, so more and more people turning to market economies. Another thing that we see, the factors of production, make sure you're good with your economic systems. Land, labor, capital are our factors of production, your natural resources, human resources, and then capital, remember, is anything made or used by man to make something else. We have market economy versus a command economy. The question is who controls those factors of production. In a command economy, the government owns and controls the factors of production, and in a market economy, individuals own them. Why are more and more people moving to market economy? What is it that makes market economy so attractive? It's the fact that there is the opportunity to make profit and to make lots of it. You think about China. China's economy has now surpassed the United States, and that has happened because of the implementation of capitalist policies in China. You think about Hong Kong, Taiwan. That's when we've seen economic growth, when they started incorporating those capitalist policies. Remember, this is a statement on your paper, the more political freedom a country has, the more economic freedoms they typically have. When people get more economic freedom, they demand political freedom. There is a relation, a correlation, a causation. We see in China that they've gotten more capitalist, more market, more economic freedom, and they are demanding more political freedoms. Okay, when we think about citizens, how to spell cleavages? Do I have too many A's there? So cleavages, what are the types of cleavages? Think about social cleavages, which can be class inequality. Religious cleavages. We can see ethnic cleavages, even gender cleavages. So remember that cleavages are divisions or separations within society. You can have many. You can have, for example, I'm a woman. I'm not a minority, but my ethnicity, like you can have more than one cleavage. You could be a member. That's cross-cutting cleavages. When we think about cleavages, make sure you know a couple of examples. I would know at least 2. So, for example, we talked about religious cleavages in Northern Ireland, Protestants versus the Catholics. We talked about ethnic cleavages in Nigeria. We talked about ethnic cleavages in Mexico, the Mesoamericans, that mestizo versus the Amerindians, the natives. We talked about gender cleavages in China being an issue. Even ethnicity, in the UK is growing. Free civil societies need interest groups. Civil societies need freedom of speech, freedom of press. This is something that indicates that you are a democracy. Subjects, participants, parochials. Subjects versus participants. Participants are active. They vote. They have a high sense of political efficacy. They are knowledgeable. Subjects usually don't know what's going on. They probably don't vote, but they obey the laws. Parochials are on the fringes. There's our guys out in Oregon who are not going to do what anybody's telling them what to do. Okay, let's move on to a huge chunk of our bit, and that is political institutions. So let's talk about lesson 5. And so we're going to look at we talked about parliamentary versus presidential. Remember, there's also mixed systems, and the mixed systems are where we call them mixed or we call them semi-presidential. So Russia would be an example of a mix. So if we go back to our countries over here, the UK is parliamentary, Mexico is presidential, Russia is mixed, China is mixed, Nigeria is presidential, and Iran is mixed. So when we're looking at just kind of thinking, for example-wise, think about the United States versus UK, kind of as a good example. So the US would be a really good example of presidential, and the UK would be a really good example of parliamentary. So remember that in parliamentary, the advantages, disadvantages, thinking about these kind of things. In a parliamentary, you have two people, so you have two executives. You have the head of state and the head of government. In the presidential, there is one executive. So one of the disadvantages of a parliamentary is there is the kind of lack of the checks and balances, which is a major advantage, I think, in the presidential. Think about the president is typically directly elected. You can argue direct election in the U.S. since we use electoral college, but remember the head of the parliamentary is actually going to be a member of parliament. It has to be in that majority party of parliament. We also think about the fact, a major advantage of parliament is that you don't have that divided government because your executive is part of your legislature. In that sense, legislation is going to get passed much more easily, much more quickly. So we do have the checks and balances in the presidential system because of that. And the definite disadvantage of the presidential system can be gridlock as a result of divided government. But the fact is, in Parliament, you don't have that. So you want to think about two advantages for each of these, understand the difference, understand a country that's an example of each of these. Why would a country choose one over the other? Remember that the majority of the world uses parliamentary, just like the majority of the world is unitary. So we are an exception. We went over unitary of federal already. Head of state versus head of government. Head of government is your actual person running the country. Prime minister. The head of state is that ceremonial leader. I think that's an advantage of parliamentaries, the fact that they have those two executives where one can be focused on the ceremonial leadership where the other can actually be getting stuff done. We mentioned devolution of power. We mentioned centralization of power already. Judicial review and an independent judiciary is a very important concept for having a liberal democracy. The disadvantages of federalism we discussed already, and the cabinet. Okay, in a parliament, the cabinet is chosen by the prime minister. The president chooses it in the presidential system. Remember in the presidential system that the cabinet, they are advisors, and they often are experts in their fields, and they typically are party loyal. The prime minister, the members have to be in the legislature. He has to choose members of parliament for his cabinet, and that is based on party loyalty. It is not necessarily somebody who is an expert in their field. And he is considered to be the first among equals. There's much more of an equal status. They have to agree on things, and they'll resign if they don't. All right, let's move on to our public policy, our last thing we talked about. We actually kind of made a list of how policy happens. You actually identify the problem. We did this in fourth period. You come up with a solution. Then you actually implement it. And then in theory, there is an evaluation of that. You evaluate it. And then once it's evaluated, then you can kind of go back through this. Who's helping to identify that problem? Well, that happens through interest, articulation, and aggregation, where we see interest groups bringing their attention to the government. The actual implementation happens mostly through our bureaucracies when you think about it, because they're the ones who are actually doing that work. GDP, GNP. PPP, purchasing power parity. Make sure that we are comfortable with these definitions. Gross domestic product, gross national product. And then make sure purchasing power parity, which allows for an equal comparison. Probably going to see some kind of short answer on that. One of the other things I want you to think about is developed versus developing countries. What are the things we look at? HDI, Human Development Index, literacy rate, infant mortality rate. We look at your economic stats. We look at your GDP per capita. We look at your life expectancy. We look at the percent of your population who is under 15. All of these things are important. We're looking at economic factors. We're looking at your socioeconomic, your health standards. All of those things play factors into considering for developed or developing countries. UK is definitely a developed country. Probably our least developed is arguably going to be Nigeria. We looked at how they had such a low life expectancy. So as we kind of hit all of our key things with our different topics here, let's kind of move through looking at your short answer questions. We measure development through all of these things that we just mentioned here. Political legitimacy. Remember, legitimacy is right to rule. And one of the things we know about legitimacy is elections can be used for legitimacy, charismatic authority. Make sure you're familiar with your vocab. Just because we had a quiz doesn't mean those terms aren't going to come up on your test. Think about an example of charismatic authority, like the Ayatollah or Stalin or Hitler. They don't have to be negative. They can also be positive, like JFK, President Obama the first time he ran. Trump obviously has some kind of charisma. Like we can use charisma for good or bad. Vote of confidence. Remember that in the parliament, the prime minister is easier to get rid of because you can have a vote of no confidence versus you have to go through impeachment to get rid of a president. Illiberal versus liberal democracies. We've covered that. Remember, procedural versus substantive. I still feel like I'm saying that wrong. Second period, we looked it up. But procedural, that's your illiberal. Looks good on paper, but is there substance to it? That's liberal. Relationships between states, regime, and government we covered. Unitary, we talked about that. We compared presidential and parliamentary. We talked about social cleavages. Transparency. Do you know what your country is doing? Transparency is very important if we want a liberal democracy so that we can see what they're doing. I think freedom of speech, freedom of press. For example, like we talked about in Turkey, it's definitely not very transparent. How transparent is Russia? Those are things we look at. PPP is better because it actually puts it at an even playing field. That's your number 10. Apparently, I think liberal and illiberal is important because I have it on here twice. Economies. Okay, waves of democratization. So when we think about democratization, those waves, we had the first wave, which was post-World War I. The second wave was basically kind of post-World War II. And then the third wave was that kind of post-communism. The question is, are we in a fourth wave? I made the argument that are we possibly seeing a fourth wave with the Arab Spring as we see more democracy happening in especially countries in the Middle East? I think that's something still to be seen, but you could argue that there is a fourth wave coming. All right, make sure that you can put our CG6 countries on a map when you're thinking about Nigeria. That's sometimes a tougher one. Nigeria, it's here, kind of the little corner of Africa. When you're thinking about Iran, you've got Turkey, and then Iraq. Iran is that larger country. So just remember that Iran is larger than Iraq. Okay, and then there's kind of an example of a FRQ. That's a pretty easy one. You're more likely to see something comparing parliamentary and presidential. We're going to do some comparisons of that. I'll mention one other question that's not on your review guide, and that's referendum, which we just recently talked about in class. Referendums, remember, are voted a national vote, but they have the force of law. And referendums, why are they good? People like them because it's a source of legitimacy. It's more democratic because the people are actually getting to vote on it. Some current examples, there is a possible referendum coming up with the UK voting about whether or not to remain in the EU. That was a promise that David Cameron made, that he would make that happen. Scotland in the UK, their recent vote on independence was an example of a referendum. Boris Yeltsin, who was first president of Russian Federation, when they voted on the Constitution. So the president in Russia can call for a referendum. The prime minister can call in the UK. So that hits all the big highlights, a lot of different things. Vocabulary is really what you want to focus on. Make sure that you're comfortable with those terms.